Alright, this is my reply to Gary. Hi, Gary. In your video, I have 4 minutes and 9 seconds of your video noted. So let's start at 45 seconds into your video.
Look, logic is about a relationship. And that's it. That's all it is. It's relationship.
Well, this is going to be the theme of this video, right? Yes, it's about relationships. I've been telling you for years that that's what relativity really means. Because you see, in classical logic and epistemology, logic is not about relationships. The one real relationship of implication is not even a relationship. If A, then B can be expressed as not A and not B. It just means that if A is true, then B can't be false. It could be some sort of a weird coincidence in terms of actual implication. It does not have to be direct. It just has to be coincident truth functionality, basically. In classical epistemology, they assume that logic tells the whole story. Logic says that you have to have, an object has to be classified by its built-in characteristics, which you can simulate having in mathematics. In real life, as you say in this whole video, and I've been telling you for years, it's actually a thing's relationships. In logic, you cannot define things in terms of their relationships. You have to do it in terms of properties, which leads to things like trying to define the battery in terms of, does it have energy in it? Does it have a place to connect to it? Instead of just saying the obvious, is it used as a battery? Can it be used as a battery? Questions like that, which can be answered.
I could pick up this bottle and we could say, do the Marcus Aurelius thing. What is it? What does it do? What is its function? How does it blah, blah, blah.
Right, and the issue, though, is that in classical knowledge, and I'm going to publish these notes, there'll be a link, so you can see the note I wrote to myself when I was watching it the first time. If you have something like a pen, it has to inherently be meant to write, like essence. And the relativists say, no, there is no essence, there's relationships. So if it's used to write, then it might be a pen, maybe it's a pencil, maybe, but if it's used as a writing implement, then it's some sort of a writing implement.
Definitions. Some definitions are explicit and narrow, some definitions are broad and expansive and leave all kinds of possibility. You could
Right, some are narrow, some are broad, none are infinitely general, and none are infinitesimally narrow. That's a relativistic position. This whole video of yours, you are endorsing a relativistic position, and you don't realize that if you went into a philosophy department at an Ivy League college, they would disagree with you, and I would be the one using philosophical language to argue no, it's true, and George Lakoff would be there going, look, I actually have a whole career in this, so you can't just try to authority fallacy me out of the question. And you ironically would be going, no, I agree with them. But what do you want from the objectivist epistemology? If things are defined in terms of their relationships, you're a relativist, period. Whatever words you want to use. What do you want out of the objectivist epistemology? Well, the only thing I could think of is the ability to determine what is right for other people, right? Without being them.
You have to qualify the degree of hotness. So you need more explicit language, more explicit definition. And that's where logic can break down.
Okay, that's exactly it. See, objective knowledge is universally true. That means doesn't need to be qualified relative to something else. Okay? So again, you are arguing in this whole video for a relativist epistemology. I have offered both my own and other people's, like Lakoff's, formalizations for a skeptical or relativist epistemology, which you reject irately. But why? It turns out you have a relativist epistemology, because this is the crucial issue, is how relationships are dealt with. Are they incidental? Do you really have things that happen to relate? Or do you have relationships and phenomena of relationships that could be called things? Okay, now the second one seems more surreal, but as you talk this through, you see how it's relative to whether the thing is black, and it's relative to light and what it means for something to be black in our eyes and our brain that it perceives it. It's relative, relative, relative. In a sense, it's more obvious, but it seems like it shouldn't be, that things are relative. When gray text, of all people, oh my God, says that we're all relativists, pretty sure this is what he's getting at. We live relativistically. We want to say we're objectivist because of certain features that objectivism claims, and not rightly so, right?
And we know in common conversation, when we say tree, what we mean.
Right, again, qualified by normal conversation. Right? That doesn't work in logic. There can't be those kinds of qualifications. There isn't supposed... The context is the universal everything at once. You're not allowed to ignore certain things. Ignoring certain things and saying it's true in a context, if you ignore these certain things in this context, that's essentially relativistic. You don't believe me, but if you pushed what you're telling me in this video among philosophers, they'd go no. And the logicians, they'd go no. Right? The logicians might go, well, no, that's not how it works in logic. Maybe that's the way it is in reality. I don't really care. I like logic. The cognitive scientists are the ones trying to rectify the two, figuring out how we really think of classification and all these things that are related to these issues, and get, knowledge out of it, when it can't be the classical definition. Because as you point out, things are relative to, this context and this environment and other so-called objects. And classical epistemology for thousands, it's not that surprising, right? Classically, people have believed in a deity. It's not that surprising that people have been this wrong for thousands of years, and it's a near miss. Like, look at religion. You could be pissed at religion. Come on, the Ten Commandments are a pretty decent near miss. Half of them, pretty good. Don't kill people. Okay, the near miss. Why? Well, because God will be pissed off. Well, what's the real reason? Well, because it makes you a prick, and you don't want to get killed, and, other reasons. Near miss. Okay, so logic is a much, much more near to the target miss in this respect. When you get down into the extra digits, it doesn't allow you to acknowledge relationships the way that we all inherently do anyway.
Oh, see, again, you're breaking it because you're adding more complexity to the qualification, to how it's being defined.
No. You were talking about the tree there. I guess I should have made the video edited a little more, but a little longer. But you're talking about a tree. Now, the point is you're adding these trees. A mouse, though it's a mammal and can have emotions and ideas about the tree, perceives the tree as a world. Not as just necessarily a one thing. It goes up the tree and then there's the canopy. It might not even know it's a single tree because of its perspective on it. A bug wouldn't think of it as one tree. It is relative to your perspective. A monkey, if the tree is in a canopy and once you get up in it, it's connected, even a monkey might not think of it as one tree. And a human in that situation would probably think of it as one trunk, but if it melded into a canopy, still might think of one trunk as part of the forest, not as part of one tree. These are all possible thoughts, and the interesting thing about the cognitive science is it's very National Geographic. They go around, it's like, how does everybody think of stuff? And they find people that think that the future is behind them because they can't see it. They think of what's in front of them as what they can see. So even though 90% of all the cultures think of the future is in front of them, that's not fixed in stone. And it's not fixed in stone with how you count trees or with anything, and it doesn't have to be. When you focus on the fact that there can be facts about relationships, like one thing has more energy than another, or you can't say which one's moving, but they're moving at each other. When you can say facts about relationships, you regain all of the things that someone like you wants to make a compelling argument. But it can't be absolutely compelling, but it can be relatively compelling, like relative to things you have in common. Like, you probably don't want to be suffocated. How can I argue that? You're a stranger on the internet. I've never met you. I don't know your attitude towards having oxygen. Well, relative to your biology and the pain sensors and everything that happens if someone suffocates you, well, I can make that prediction. Still a prediction. It's still not absolute. Maybe you're a lizard in a human suit. Maybe you hold your breath so long that the test would fail, even if ultimately there was a truth to it, or, all these qualifiers. And I would agree with what you would probably say, which a lot of those qualifiers don't matter, because relative to being a human and various assumptions between us here, you need oxygen, right? Okay, so you can regain these compelling facts, but when you always bring this back around to antinatalism, you're going to fail at biological freedom, which is individual and does not resolve itself to a very compelling argument in terms of forcing other people. Now, it can approach that level of being compelling, right? You could talk to an individual and they think about it and go, you're right, I won't reproduce, or yeah, you're right, I will this or that. But that last moment, you're never going to prove it shouldn't be their, decision, is what I believe. But back to this wonderful revelation that you two are a relativist, but just don't know it.
Find it. We've described it quite accurately, quite adequately is the key word here. For the sake of this level of conversation, that it's
Sorry, that was the last
and
one.
ever and ever and ever, because you're going to demand somebody to account for every molecule in the entire universe, merely to say, mud is muddy.
But Gary, this is the thing. Relativists don't do that. They say there's an infinite number, and you never get an absolute enough number of facts. But you can get enough for the context. Don't you understand? This is what I'm trying to justify. Because in classical epistemology, that's not good enough. You need to have all the facts, and everything else is totally irrelevant. Right? Good enough because of what job you need to get done relative to the situation at hand. That's a relativist position. But what if there is no end, like pi, where it goes on forever? So this is what's happened with fractals and so on. Is we see even in a new kind of science, cellular automata, that there's infinite detail, even in pure mathematics, something purely deterministic. There is something infinite and that can't be captured without the use of taking time and running something through. So nature could be like pi. Now, what I think is that it doesn't matter. To get to the moon, you need pi. You need the number pi. But you don't need it to infinite details. Even to get from here to the moon, here to another galaxy, you need probably even a better version of pi. Or maybe not, if you just keep double checking your coordinates, and you can stay on course that way. But like, if you wanted to figure out the perfect course from here, probably need pi involved with all the angles and stuff to a really high degree. Now, most people, you can figure out something close enough, like for making furniture, with 3.14. Okay, but there's no intellectual justification for that in old school philosophy and an understanding of logic. Now, in cognitive science and sort of more cognitive philosophy of cognition, there is starting to be an answer. Okay, we use metaphors that within a particular context are accurate enough to get things done, and you question those metaphors, to get better metaphors, and you use logic to do that. But you don't use logic because it's somehow pure and even getting the evidence is logical. You use logic because it transforms evidence of a quality A into, further conclusions of quality A. So if the evidence is good, the conclusion will be good. If the evidence is crap, the conclusion will be crap. But there's a relationship. That allows you to use your reasoning and then go back and focus on making sure your input is good.
Actual thing existed in actual space and wasn't just a theoretical concept, it would have an actual number.
I totally agree. Cosina McCool disagreed with me on this. I had trouble expressing it satisfactorily for him, and ultimately even for myself in a way. But I agree. The pi is a ratio between the circumference of a circle and, if you forgive the expression, the circumference of a square. Right? But those are both ideal things, right? And their ratio is ideal. And it turns out that that ratio between those ideal things has an infinite number of digits, which I agree with you, tells us that it's not actually real, which tells you that the circle and square are probably not actually real, that this is all ideal. A real ratio would be a real number. Well, okay, that was misspoken in that they call these real numbers. Would be a rational number. In the real world, they are. But only because you give up measuring. It's not that they might not be infinite. You just give up measuring because I don't really care the sub-millimeter accuracy. But in the ideal world, it's interesting that if you find out that, well, if you want to get that ratio perfect, how many digits would you need? Infinite. It means that there's something unreal about ideals, idealizations. But they still are good compass settings. They still help a lot. They save you the work of measuring a lot. You know that if you more and more make a more and more ideal square and a more and more ideal circle, and you measure the circumferences, and you get the number more and more accurately, over time it's going to approach pi. You know that ahead of time. We've done enough to know that. We don't have to do that. So it's useful, but it doesn't mean that it's real and actual in a particular way. And this is the point. What has been called objective metaphysics, the logic part, has been very, very useful. And we don't want to give it up. But we don't want to pretend, just because it's been useful, that that's the way the universe is. Because objective, logical metaphysics, the ontology of classical objectivity, which you have advocated in your language, even if you didn't quite understand what you were advocating, I guess, has been a useful thing that we can continue to understand. It's just not been what's in reality, and it doesn't take relationships into account. So when you get to things like, why does mathematics work the way it does? You can't explain it with the classical ideas of containment and inference. You can't.
Can't have a conversation that deals in quanta because we have no way of identifying, measuring, or in any way relating to it.
Well, see, that's not true. We can, and this is a big part of my project, to help us have words where we have those discussions. The reason we can't do it right now is we're stuck on objective understandings of terms instead of relativistic ones, which is ironic. You agree with relativism, but you want to stick with objective understandings of words. You're like, yes, relativism is true, but let's call relationships qualities. Let's call a relationship a quality of one thing. No, a relationship takes at least two things, and the quality is just something describing one end. If that one thing is in a relationship with something else, then the quality would be described differently. Let's take that into account. There's a lot of implications.
It's about these fucking words, okay? Words are the definition of things. We use words to define the things.
No, this I wanted to point out. Words are not for defining things. They're for identifying things, right? They're like a finger pointing at something, okay? And what they point at is an idea of things. And if you think that idea, ideally, you're trying to get in the frame of mind that you would get if you saw the phenomena in question. If you see the phenomenon in question makes you think a certain way, and you're trying to make it so that a word, if you start with a word, you'll think that way. That's what's going on.
Are. And then words like speciesism or some other kind of word, the definition can migrate depending on, what grade of science you're applying, how it's...
Okay, again, in classical understanding of language and objective logic, definitions can't migrate. They can't migrate and get better. They're either false or true. If they migrated, then they were false. If they're still migrating, they're still false. Okay? And I'm not satisfied with that, and I've been explaining why, no, definitions can migrate. There are some explanations. I came up with them, like you, over my own thought process, but I've also become exposed to certain academic support for these kinds of views. Whatever. The fact is, you can't have migrating definitions in an objective, totally deducible system like you often advocate. Now, when we get down to the really small, way out there decimal points, turns out you agree with me, but you need to come up with the reason why you want to use this language that says the opposite of what you evidently believe, which is that things are defined by relationships, which is probably the shortest definition of relativity.
And so that's where that breaks down. But again, it's about the language not being explicit enough, not about the changes in the real definition. Because our language, in terms of defining a species, isn't quite right. It's kind of sloppy. Doesn't change the fact of the relationships that exist in the world.
I'm just pointing out you keep saying relationships.
Right? I mean, a smart God is logically incoherent. Why would that be logically incoherent? What would be logically incoherent is that he would create a dumb creation.
I brought this up to you in Stickham, and I was surprised you defended this point. Yeah, the omnipotence and all the things we agree are incoherent. So, yeah, a smart God is an incoherent idea. It doesn't matter smart or dumb. I mean, a smart God would have to be too smart to exist as a logical contradiction. You know what I mean? It's just like, anyway.
Somehow your thing has lost which thing I was on, which is kind of fucking irritating.
Okay. Software moment. Greytex is going to hate this. But the thing is, it used to be, I just fixed this tonight, before I made this video, that basically when it was playing, if you hit the start time to the second resolution, to seconds, it would highlight that note. And when you left that, it would highlight the next note when it hit its first second. So my JavaScript ability is going up a few notches, and now it's smarter and it can tell if it's in the node, and so you shouldn't have that problem. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, back to the main show.
Again, so you use the key word, relationship, and that's all we're really talking about here. Like I said, everything can have a relation. This has a relationship to the word black.
Yeah, and Gary, I don't know, you either look it up or take my word. That is in contradiction to classical logic in the way logic is expected to work. Things are defined by their inherent essential qualities as things in themselves, even if they're in a void. A pencil imagined in a void where there's nothing but this one pencil is a pencil. And we can all imagine that being true. Why? Because we can't imagine void. We can just imagine a world of everything where everything's not being looked at but the pencil, and we get a pencil in itself. But as you know, because of this video, I know you know, it's in relationship to its use, it's in relationship to the light, what color it is. It's not an inherent quality, it's an inherent, there's an inherent feel to it, right? Because it's still the laws of physics. You can trace along what it's going to be. But if something is translucent, you're not surprised that this guy sees a rainbow and that guy sees nothing. He's not at the right angle. How could that be? The rainbow has inherent qualities. Why is that? No, it's the atmosphere and all of the relationships, and it turns out the word inherent is very thing in its selfish and doesn't go with, you know, looking at relationships. Now, what's really between relationships? Well, and particle physics, it looks like it could be further relationships. Why? Because you're going to go down to having fields with disturbances in them, right? So like an idealized liquid medium with, you know, more like the electromagnetic medium with disturbances in it. That actually does look like a pure relationship. In other words, it's energy wiggling around or waiting to wiggle, and so you don't need things. You start off with these wiggles that are essentially a disturbance of a field, the disturbance being the relationship of, you know, time, something happening in time, and then everything else is built up from those. So it does work out. We just, at our scale and us looking at everything in terms of the body and how the body can interact with it, we did fine with things as things. But it turns out that they're bundles of relationships, and that's fine. We've thought it all through, and like you like to say, you know, we know enough to handle that without freaking out. And you look at things this way, but somehow you're hooked on the old language.
That things must produce more than they consume to be declared efficient, purposeful, and worthy of existence.
I just found that interesting, but to the degree that that's true, we've already discussed that there's different criteria of efficiency, right? And that's where the relativity will come in, even to something universal. The wiggle room is in efficient in what way, right? Like, I want to know the most efficient route from here to California. And it makes a big difference if I mean efficient relative to the resource of time or efficient relative to the resource of fuel. Right?
These have a meaning, which is that it can be used in some relationship with paper and me and whatnot. Right.
But those are its properties. Properties are its relationship.
So you're a relativist then?
It's also black. The relationship is to the word black, the concept of black, the other things that are black. It's all about. Description is about describing the relationship.
That's what George Lakoff and myself and others are trying to argue, and you have been appearing to disagree with, for some unknown reason, evidently.
It's real, and
there we go.
It's real, and
yeah, the thing is, the relationship network is real, and you can triangulate all kinds of information out of it, as we know. And as I've been trying to tell you for 3 or 4 years, I believe in real things.
I'm saying it's not logical. It is essentially the whole fucking. You don't have logic without it, because it's the only way you can glean the knowledge. You have to have the knowledge to do the logic. You have to have the information.
Now, you're talking about experimentation, and I agree with you. That's what I've been arguing. But it is not a part of classical logic. Classical logic wants to start deducing every reality from something like A equals A. That's their dream, Gary. They want to deduce things from A equals A and the law of the excluded middle. You're not supposed to go to what they call synthetic facts that you have to go observe. Plato wanted to figure everything out, contemplating, like the old idea of we all know right from wrong and side for real. Plato is like, we all know everything. We all know the perfect leaf. We all know, or even if we don't, it still exists perfectly without any of this dirty reality. Seems to be the hang-up, along with misogyny of the Athenians here. The world was dirty. They had that one. So they didn't believe in experience. Experience was a pure liar. And they did not endorse it. Okay, so you and I, we're experientialists. George Lakoff uses that term a lot. We're experientialists. We believe things are based in experiment. We use logic, sure, but what are we using it on? Experiences. And that's not what objective metaphysics allows, whether you realize that or not.
There's the obvious relationship between information and logic, and information and experimentation. That's part of this logic.
But you've been disagreeing with me, and I've been explaining to you, and you don't get how this impacts your own views that you've got. What you have is a relatively strong argument that people should think twice before having children and in fact not have them. Relatively strong. But you want it to be absolutely strong, so you're taking these people's really shitty epistemology where they said, look, you don't need experience. If you just accept that you don't need experience to prove knowledgeable facts, then you could tell other people what to do and be right to do so.
So yeah, this is a necessity. Information is knowledge, is logic, is relationship.
You and I agree, but objectivist logic doesn't agree with you and me.
Focusing on these words, these are really important. It's because it's about the words we're using, and it's about the precision of that language. So again, I'm going to focus on these.
Again, you and Lakoff and I agree the language is very important. It frames what can be true. Lakoff says that what is called true is what matches up with frames as we understand them. And if you break a frame and have to come up with a new metaphor, a new understanding, like a new paradigm of science every once in a while, a new understanding as you grow older in your life and have better cognition, go from a child to adult, say, you know, that the language is going to determine what you think is true and whether you think it even makes sense to ask if Santa Claus is true or not. That's our view. That's a cognitive science kind of, the mind is just a wetware computer type attitude, some sort of an organ. Not like a desktop, but, you know, something working, a real physical thing. The classical logical view. The classical logic can be used inside that view, but the objectivists have thought no, classical logic matches reality perfectly, and it can't be dependent on language. We've discovered a perfect language, so it's related, but it can't be dependent on a particular language. It can't even, their view can't even take into account that there's multiple languages of logic. It has to pretend there's some fundamental one that's never been discovered yet, really. They get very vague about that.
All right, so it's just some conversations require precise language, some conversations do not.
That is essentially a relativist position. Objectively, they all require perfection.
In my opinion, the game being played here is that some people are just trying to escape simple logical truths like life sucks.
The game being played here is that you have a fairly good view of reasoning, and it's relativistic, but you don't want to admit that, so you can argue that you're in a position to tell other people the quality of their life without regard to the facts of relativism, and that things are defined by relationships, and that whether their life is worth living is relative to their subjective experience, which you cannot ever access.
I'm just saying that there's a whole chain of logic that leads to that conclusion, and all of that logic is solid, and people just keep trying to escape the solidity of that logic.
The way I see it is, logic can be very solid, like a skyscraper, but no skyscraper is infinitely strong. It can withstand any kind of earthquake of any magnitude, including meteors, and nothing is infinitely strong. So I have always made clear, I believe, in strong arguments, weak arguments, relative to each other. I just know that there are no infinitely strong arguments. And there's some things you'd have to prove, like what another person should do with their body, that would require infinitely strong arguments. There are people that have believed you could make infinitely strong arguments, like, say, Plato, maybe Aristotle, but probably not Aristotle, but Plato. Infinitely strong arguments. And that therefore you could make all kinds of policies that would be justified. Now, you don't believe in that epistemology, but you want the prize of that epistemology, the right to decide for other people and be correct, disregarding their relative and subjective context. You know, the one they have to live in to actually decide those things that you can never, ever experience.